Garcia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. Um, it was a bit of a long drive up here. I came all the way up from Bakersfield, as some of you may know, and I'm driving back tonight. We got some important, yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot of my friends, one of my buddies, up in the Sierra, who's Miwok, he says, "Oh, this is Cameron. He's my road dog." You know, but that's the life I'm about. So yeah, once again, thank you all for having me here. This gives me a great opportunity to practice some of the speaking on some of the research that my tribe and I have done and some of our partners. Um, as mentioned, we're going to be focusing on Pinnacles National Park area. Some of you may know where that area is. Some of you may not. A lot of people that I talk to, they usually don't really know where Pinnacles is. I usually have to just point onto a map or just say, it's like an hour and a half south of Salinas. And they ask me, where's Salinas? I'm like, oh, it's right down the road from Monterey. They might know that one. But this is a part of California that tends to get overlooked very often, though. Pinnacles National Park itself has gained more of a reputation for being one of the hidden national parks. But the area around it, especially southern San Benito County, the San Benito Mountain area, um, Little Pinoche, all these areas in the back corner in the Diablo range, they don't really get a whole lot of spotlight. And part of what we've tried to do with my tribe is we've tried to highlight some of the archaeology and some of the overlooked history, stuff that's kind of been buried due to lack of documentation or due to sparse documentation. A lot of patchwork has been done. Um, so before I start with anything, I would like to give an acknowledgement of the land. As a native person, I want to do my due diligence. I'm coming from a whole different area, and I want to acknowledge the peoples of this territory. The city of Santa Cruz, the modern city of Santa Cruz, it's praised as one of the most well-preserved, well-documented, and active archaeological sites west of the Rockies. You go anywhere in the city, you will find heavy, deep midden layers where the indigenous peoples from this land, they did cultural burns. There was a lot of activity going on. It was one of the most populous tribal capitals before European contact here on the West Coast. It was an opportune place for plant stewardship, indigenous fire regimes, fishing, ocean hunting, chert quarrying. Matter of fact, there's several types of chert that are specific to this area alone, more specifically Cotoni Coast Aries area and Año Nuevo Beach. The obsidian and clamdis trade are very much so prevalent in the soil out here. There's a lot of documentation on it. But to acknowledge this archaeological history without acknowledging the people who created it is a failure to acknowledge the history of colonization, of the persecution of those peoples, and the attempted extermination of them. As well, the sites that we work here in Santa Cruz, they're grounds for which a lot of us have made our careers, myself included. This Santa Cruz here is where I really got my start after I got my BA. So since time immemorial and to this very moment, the land of Santa Cruz rests on that of the Upi, the Cotoni, Satane, the Cholactica, the Achista, and Atos peoples, collectively referred to as the Awaswas speaking tribes. That translates to essentially the people belonging to the north. The site of Mission Santa Cruz sits on the Awaswas village of Alontac, which is the place of the abalone. I like to say that the land remembers the people and the people remember the land. So just trying to start off with that acknowledgement. So, Kan Ampi, who am I? Well, as Pat introduced, this slide's kind of irrelevant now, but I'll do it real quick. My name is Cameron DC Garcia, Kanikarakat Cameron DC Garcia. I'm speaking in my Cholon language that my family and I we've been trying to practice more often. Like Pat said, I'm a recent anthropology graduate, and I do a lot of freelance work right now when I'm not working, doing contracting work with my tribe. As Pat mentioned, a lot of that is archaeological consulting with National Park Service. ethnobotanical research, advocacy, revitalization of language, and also now film pre-production, if you can believe it. I've been trying to work for the last several years to kind of get a better understanding of my homeland and my people's homeland and trying to piece together, where is our place in the world? How do we give people a better idea of Pinnacles region, of Picnache, as it is called in the traditional language? Here's some examples, some little photos of some stuff I've done recently. Breath of Life, and I was out doing a basic 32 fire training with my Esalen cousins up in Carmel Valley. Shout out to them. So there's gonna be four main points of my lecture today. Pre-European contact, missionization, Mexican and American occupation, and Picnache to Pinnacles. Um, when it comes to pre-European contact, I'm going to get into a bit of our creation story and how we start off things traditionally and tell it. And then early settlement patterns of the Ohlone folks, my peoples, and the wider Cholon village district, which kind of was placed somewhere between. It's a very large village district. It's hard to place down as a single, site. It's multiple seasonal sites. But it ran along the upper San Benito River, Bear Valley east of Pinnacles, Pinnacles itself on the eastern and west side, and then Cholone Creek, who I'll let you guess what Cholone Creek was named for. And I'll get more into the missionization and the establishment of where my peoples were mostly interned at, as well as that history and how we were brought into the mission system, how Mexican American occupation kind of affected us, and introduced this whole wave of homesteaders from America, especially after the gold rush, and then kind of the work that we've done recently um, in terms of like Pinnacles National Park and before that Pinnacles National Monument. So in the traditional, it's a great photo, isn't it? I use this photo for everything. On Zoom, that's my photo. That's I believe that's 966 Peakchi. That's one of the condors when they were a little bit younger though. They're all they're all oranged out now. This is a couple years ago. In the traditional way of saying, how did our world come into being? Us Alonis and us Esselins, we share a lot of common points in our creation stories. Sadly, my tribe's specific creation story was not documented. It was lost to time, but we are led to believe that ours was probably very similar to our relatives, that of the Eslan and the Mutsun and the Rumsun. There's a lot of common pieces within our creation stories that bring everything together. As I always say, as I always tell it, um, at the beginning of all things, at the beginning of our history, the world had already ended. There was a great dirge, a great flood, which had destroyed everything. And depending on who you ask, the characters may vary, but the three common ones are coyote, hummingbird, and eagle were the ones to survive this great flood. And they flew to the highest points across the land trying to dodge the incoming waters. Some of these peaks and places are named. One of the most famous ones, Mount Diablo, as it's called in English, is the place where some believe that was the highest point that they went to survive the Great Dirge. And this is how we describe the creation of all things. That's how we understand it in the traditional way of our place in our cultural landscape. I don't like using maps too often, but I'm gonna use maps just because, like I said, it's kind of hard to place things without really knowing, So we're up there in Santa Cruz right now. Um, the areas I'm going to be talking about specifically is Pinnacles as well as the Upper San Benito River. So imagine that little green dot right there. That's generally the northern scape of Pinnacles National Park. I couldn't get it exactly on there. This is based off of Randall Milliken's map made in 2006 for his report on the Priest Valley. As we understand it, there were multiple village districts, as was common to the Ohlone, Coast-Noan, and Esalen peoples. You have multiple independent villages, sometimes which are governed by a district comandante or captain, and then each individual village was run independently of one another. In regards to trade, obviously, they would exchange things such as clam disc, foodstuffs, beads, and what have you. Life was interconnected insofar as you could travel to your neighbor and trade, and then they traded. Oh, you're good. Yeah, a little background music. Take the edge off. Insofar as you could trade up to your neighbor and they could trade it down the line. Most of the trade flowed southwards into the interior, obviously, from the coast. A lot of the prized items were obviously abalone, olivella, things like that. Um, when talking about Pinnacles, people, whenever they think about it, if you've been there, you might think one thing. And this is what all of my friends thought when we took them there last year. Pinnacles is very hot. Especially the western side. The eastern side gets pretty hot too, but the western side, I mean, the eastern side can also get very hot. Obviously, how you say, the ecology of the region has changed a lot over the last several hundred years, especially. Um, Pinnacles had a lot more water in the past. The San Benito River had a lot more water. There was a lot more oak savanna before some type of event happened, which we'll get into. There was a lot more oak savanna. There were more riparian areas. There was a clearing out of the chaparral by us native people. We would culturally burn it seasonally. If you refer back to the Kent Lightfoot report of 2013 on his archaeological studies of McCabe Canyon in Pinnacles National Park, there is an emphasis put on burning out the areas of the savanna oak bottoms to increase acorn production and to chase away the Chamise chaparral up into the hills. This was a deliberate act done to clear up area for settlement, for harvesting acorns and other tubers, wildflowers for their seeds, trying to have more areas for game to travel through. This was a very much so cultivated, stewarded land at one point. Like I said, Pinnacles isn't always dry and it's not always hot. There's very much so still life at Pinnacles. It's actually one of the most well-preserved seed banks this side of the West Coast. I think the only other place that's more preserved than really Pinnacles in terms of its native habitat and native plants is probably like Point Reyes. That's one of the few places that hasn't been touched as much. The immense life at Pinnacles, you would have this area serving as more or less almost like a highway in the spiritual sense and the literal sense. Trade and commerce were very much so common throughout the region. On one side of the Pinnacles, you'll have your seasonal camps that are focused entirely on hunting deer, hunting bear stuffs, um, and what have you. The closer you get towards San Benito Mountain in the east, the closer you get into the pine forests. The further west you go, you get closer into that coastal shrub. You'll find other different species, especially going towards the Salinas River past Pinnacles. You're getting more into that kind of historically swampy area where there's a lot of water flow, but there's also seasonal droughts because dry creeks. If you go onto the eastern side of Pinnacles nowadays, you might find a nice little sign there. I don't know who put that sign up, but if you read the sign, it says Heartland of the Cholon People, Pinnacles National Park Service. That's pretty cool. And on the bottom, it says Maxena Wayas Oniete. There's a couple different ways to translate this. Um, the best way that I've seen actually is a theory is that it's supposed to represent the Catholic prayer, the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from our enemies. But it may actually, depending on how you do the linguistic comparison, it may actually refer to let us sit with our enemies. Maxena referring to us, Wayas meaning enemy or enemies, and then Oniet possibly actually having a Mutsun language root. A lot of my work is kind of a cross between archaeology and linguistics. I haven't gotten to the point where I've made the jump into archaeolinguistics. I'd have to, as a whole other culture group, basically. But um, this does play a good part in how I try to visualize the world and study this place. So, referring back to the area and the history of this area, one second. Um, there is a large space that we're trying to cover. Because keep in mind, one of the first things we need to think about when it comes to archaeology is that there's no such things as borders for the people of the past. People are very much so transitional and they're seasonal. Sadly, one of the flaws of trying to do archaeology in Pinnacles is we're really much so um, compounded and kind of boxed in with the borders of the national park. Keep in mind, it's a big park. Pinnacles is it's a really big place, a couple miles across, and God knows it feels like it's the world when you're hiking it. But especially on a hot day when it gets into 90 at 2 p.m. and you're dropping dead, it feels like a big place. But realistically though, a lot of the areas, the transitional areas and places for commerce and travel, such as Chalone Creek, the park only covers about half of Chalone Creek. The other half of it, more or less, is all on private ranch land. Same goes for a lot of the other waterways throughout the park. For the northern fork of Chalone Creek and the southern fork of Chalone Creek, they're cut off. Um, the eastern tributaries that lead out from the San Benito River completely cut off the second you leave the park on the eastern side. So a lot of the habitational areas that would have been much more opportune aren't specifically in the park, is what we've realized. A lot of them are outside the park. So this is more or less an approximation of not our total grand territory. I'm not claiming all this. I want to make that very, very clear. I'm not claiming all this. This is an approximation of basically the potential areas for Chalone habitation for my tribe, as well as the possible areas of linguistic cultural overlap. The place that we refer to as Chalone today really only referred to a large village district, maybe with a principal site, but definitely some place that had overlap and influence over multiple different seasonal camps and seasonal villages. Obviously, it was centered most likely somewhere along the Upper San Benito and the Bear Valley area east of Pinnacles. But in terms of Chalone speaking villages, those are a little bit further out, extending all the way out towards San Benito Mountain and the Hernandez Reservoir area, which is out towards like Idria Mercury Mine, if anyone knows where that area is. It's a pretty rough area. Even possibly extending out to Panoche Valley in the north. This is why I refer to this area as kind of like a hypothetical, not hypothetical, as a proverbial Badlands area. This part of California is very rough, especially after the advent of colonization. It was not the most opportune place to be settling down or trying to build any sort of metropolis. Places like the New Idria Mercury Mine were a little bit of a fluke in terms of um, them becoming a population center. It became a population center due in large part to the fact that it had a cash crop, essentially, mercury. But, anything south of Tres Pinos and Piscinas area today, there's not really any settlements out there besides individual families, ranching folk. The majority of Cholon people were missionized at Mission Soledad. We refer back to the map. It's, right there west of Pinnacles National Park. The majority of Chilean people were missionized at Mission Soledad, Our Lady of Perpetual Solitude. And if you refer to Engelhart, if any of you guys have read Engelhart and some of their works, it was a very desolate place to be rallied up into. The express purpose, obviously, of the Padres was to convert Native people to Catholicism. And part of this as well, to civilize Native folks, was to also transition them forcibly from a seasonal, what some may refer to as hunter-gatherer, I don't like that term, but hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a agrarian, nearly subsistence farming lifestyle, similar to that of the homeland in Spain. Engelhardt writes that when it comes to Mission Soledad, the various people who were missionized there, not just Cholon, but they're obviously the starting population of Esalen people who were there. Later on, near the latter end of the mission period, getting into like the 1830s, Yokach people from the Central Valley were brought in, specifically from Tulare Lake, Paashi area, such as the Tachi and Chutnut peoples. With the decline of the mission system after it was acquired by Mexico after its independence in 1821, in 1821, the mission system very much still fell into neglect. Mission Soledad was a part of this as well, was a part of this neglect faced by the Mexican central government. Throughout um, the 1800 to its last year in operation, 1835, it's written that Mission Soledad faced three droughts, two major epidemics, and at least one back to the land situation where a large subset of the population is said to have actually returned back to the hills. When it comes to Engelhardt's writing, he doesn't necessarily they don't necessarily specify if this was the Esselins or the Cholon. It may have just been a collective of what is referred to as the Solidariano, mixed identity people at Mission Soledad. And Soledad more or less ceased operations by 1835 after the last padre, Vicente Francisco Saria, died. He starved to death at the pulpit. He refused to submit to the central Mexican government, but also wasn't going to be going back to Spain anytime soon. So that's how he decided to go out. If you go to Mission Soledad today, it's a reconstruction of the former mission. Before this, it was more or less a couple walls that were 2 or 3 feet high across. A lot of the reconstruction effort, similar to most other missions, was done by the Daughters of the West in the 1950s. I mean, it's nice looking. It's very much so like, there's a big flower garden out front. My family and I were friends with the caretaker there, um, Lorena, and you know, it's mixed feelings though when you're actually being there. A lot of my family were raised Catholic, and it's a weird identity to have when you're going to church on Sundays and then you're going to sweat lodge on Saturdays. A lot of this syncretic identity and this having to make amends with the past and your current identity plays a part into the archaeology and our place in the world.
Is the reconstruction on the actual site of the original mission? Is it built where the actual mission was?
So the only standing buildings at Mission Soledad today is this main building right here originally was actually a storehouse, which was converted into a chapel after one of the floods. And the side building here on the right-hand side, that's actually where all the Padres' quarters used to be, but only about 1/4 of the quadrangle actually exists. The women's dormitories are gone. The cemeteries, which we believe there were two at least on the northern and southern sides, those are no longer really there. And well, I don't really want to get into it, but um, I'll just say the Mission Soledad, like a lot of the other missions, is operated by the diocese. So
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, if you want me to talk about more about the cemeteries, I'll talk to you guys about it afterwards when we're not being recorded. Um, but yeah, a majority of the mission, like the workshops, a lot of the buildings have not been reconstructed. There has been a plan for several, oh God, almost decade and a half now for how to reconstruct it, but the funds and the permitting haven't allowed it. The city of Soledad hasn't really approved. One of the good things about trying to find this archaeology, trying to reconstruct areas, is that we get to look through some interesting documents. Um, After the fall of the mission system and the Mexican government kind of taking over things and congratulating their veterans of their War of Independence, um, a lot of the veterans who fought in the War of Independence received land grants from the central Mexican government. Um, these are very useful, these maps, because they give us a bit of idea of how the people at that time were thinking of the landscape. Because for us, there's not a really great big documented, um, not a great amount of documented evidence pointing towards name locations, village sites. A lot of that, the mission was flooded 3 times. Anything referring to that may have been lost during those floods. But with the Decieno land grant maps, we're able to kind of infer how um, the Mexican government and the people who were living in the area were interpreting the landscape and referring to the landscape. So this area specifically, this is where the city of Soledad is today. This is the Diciano of the San Vicente land grant, the Moras land grant specifically. So this upper section right here, this little plateau, that's where the city of Soledad is today. This river down here, that's the Salinas River. In the map, it's referred to as the Rio de Monterrey. That's obviously the old name. But if we look in the top right corner, we'll see a little something. Lomas de la Sierra del Cholón, the hills on the Cholón mountain range. So what we're seeing in terms of the cartography of these land grant maps is that this area, which this would be around Thompson Canyon, I believe, leading up towards Pinnacles area. That's basically the canyons that you take to get onto the western side of the visitor center. This area is being referred to as the Cholón Mountain Range. In the baptismal records, if you go to the Huntington, a lot of the baptismal, the baptees, yeah, let's call them that, the people who are being baptized, these Cholón people who are being baptized, some of them are referred to specifically just as Cholón, or they're referred to as their specific village or family group, but they're coming rumbo del Cholón, from Cholón or towards Cholón, or the Sierra del Cholón. This village is from the Sierra del Cholón, the Cholón mountain range. So we're getting an idea that, this range, however the Padres or the Mexican government is viewing it, they know that the Cholón people came from this region. They came from this direction out towards the east. This is a secondary map. This is a little bit south of Metz, towards more Topo Valley, northeast of King City area. This is for the old Rancho San Lorenzo for Sanchez. This one was created in 1846. This one's a little bit harder to make out. This long line here, though, it's the Canada Grande, like a great big valley. That is the modern Topo Valley, if you ever look it up on a map. And if you'll notice again, the Cerro Cholón, the Cholón Hill. My best hypothesis is this area specifically refers to North Cholón Peak and South Cholón Peak in Pinnacles National Park. Just mostly due to the fact that when you come over the southern horizon, going north to Soledad area, this is more or less how they look like. This is just a theory on my end, though. But these areas specifically are being referred to and known as areas where the Cholón are thought to once inhabit. There's a reason why Cholón Peak, North Cholón Peak, South Cholón Peak are named that. The Cholón Creek, if you see on the bottom right hand corner there, that's Cholón Creek itself that runs through the park. They're knowing that this all belongs to one tribe, like large tribal district. Sometimes in the past, we've kind of debated and discussed, like, okay, were we on the eastern side of the park? Were we on the western side of the park? My tribe's cultural anthropologist and advisor, Charles Etner, he's always asserted, he's like, well, you guys were on both sides of the park, the west side and the east side. Sometimes it's like, it's discussed, well, we're right up against the Salinas River on the eastern bank of the Salinas River, or were we just in the hills? We may have just been in the hills because at the time and pre-European contact, the eastern banks of the Salinas River weren't really the best place to be settling, at least for a permanent population. Seasonal flooding. It's not the best. But we know for sure, at least, or at least generally very well, that we probably had settlements in these areas. So, obviously, after Mexico acquires California from the Spanish, when they inherited the empire from the Spanish, all of what today we consider the southwest of the United States, they held it for about 15 years until about 1846, when obviously the United States government, well, it wasn't the United States government, it was independent Americans who were trying to get their freedom, launched the Bear Flag Revolt, which eventually culminated into the Mexican-American War. By 1848, January 1848, I believe, um, Mexico's northwest territories were acquired by the United States. This would lead to eventually, obviously, the gold rush in 1850. But before then, before even that, though, American settlers did start to slowly trickle in to most of California through the northern reaches, to the southern reaches, and eventually all the way out towards the coast. People would come in through Monterey, hop the ship, and they would go settle into the hills. Um, some of the families who are known for settling in Pinnacles specifically is the Bacon family. These are photos of their um, structures that they built. On top is Oliver Bacon's house, which I'm very happy I got these photos last year because now that building no longer exists. This building was standing there since the 1950s. I believe Timothy Babulus said it was made out of World War II surplus housing. And um, Pinnacle served as a place on the eastern side and the western side for people to try and eke out a living. Sometimes as hermits, sometimes as on the western side, there were a lot of wannabe miners who didn't understand geology and tried to look for gold in a place where all you're going to find is rhyolite, more or less. If you're looking for rhyolite, it's a great place, but you ain't gonna find no gold. You ain't gonna find no silver out on the west side of Pinnacles or the east side. And these homesteaders come into the area um, going into like 1848, 1850, and they're mostly finding these areas to be what they consider completely uninhabited, but gorgeous areas, prime for maybe farming as long as the water runs, you know. In a personal communication I had with Timothy Babulus, Pinnacles National Parks, their cultural resource manager, he said when the early homesteaders came into the area, what the first thing that they would do is they would chop down a lot of the trees and they'd start rowing the fields for crops. And they start rowing the fields for either crops or to put down grass for their cattle. And when they did that, well, they kept bumping into bowl mortars, bowl mortars, manos matates. Um, and a lot of the times, these things they would end up getting collected and they were eventually passed down family lines. There are some families in the San Benito area who have major collections of these things. And oh, I have feelings and thoughts about that. But you know what? At least they're not completely lost. At least they stay in the area. Um, but these homesteaders, they're assuming that like, this land has been completely uninhabited. The reason why is because in 1810, 1815, that is around the time when Pinnacles region, San Benito area, San Benito Mountain, Panoche Valley, Silver Creek, all these different areas. By that point, almost all of them are depopulated of Cholon people, and the missions start going more and more inland. Um, this is the case for Mission Soledad, Mission San Juan Bautista up north in the modern city of San Juan, even with, in some cases, with Mission Carmel. up at Monterey. So when these homesteaders come in, they're basically finding, well, what I refer to as what is now the lost archaeology, because it was taken and put somewhere else, in their houses and things, in personal collections. So that is sort of the historic history. It's not a full in-depth discussion on that. I don't want to point any fingers or try to rile up any feathers, saying like I want my things. That's just that's just how history played out. Sadly, that's just what happened. A lot of the archaeology of our region was collected very very early on. Um, very, very early on, as well as when Pinnacles was established as a national park, as a national monument by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1908. A lot of the early visitors of the park, they tended to collect things as well. Even though the Antiquities Act of 1906 only passed a couple years earlier, people of that era were still taking things. A lot of the most opportune places, a lot of the trails of the area most likely had their items stolen and looted at that time. So what's happened since then? Well, I'm going to talk about my tribe as well as the Amundsen tribal band, our partners in crime, so to say. Um, for my tribe and my family, we had to become reestablished after several generations of basically being persecuted and hunted down as Native people. My family, specifically the Chilon Indian Council of Bakersfield, our family left the Soledad, Monterey County area around 1848. A lot of us ended up moving down to San Luis Obispo area, and the two surviving lines of our tribe and family are now almost all settled in Bakersfield, California. They got established out there in the 1870s. Our cousin tribe, the Amamutsa, have a very similar story. A lot of their lineages, some of them stayed in their historical areas near Gilroy, near Watsonville, but many of their families ended up migrating down into the valley as well, such as in areas like Fresno and Madera. It's very, very common for tribes who were located out on the coast attempting to eke out a living in the mid 1800s and the late 1800s, doing a very much so odd jobs, being vaqueros, being maids, being mineral miners, being um, what did some of my friends say? Sheep shearers. That was a big one too, apparently. Fruit pickers, all these different jobs. Um, and eventually, when that work dried up and real estate went up, those people tended to relocate into the valley where work was much more prominent, much more regular. Um, the cost of living was much lower. So, if I recall correctly, Amamutsen began its professional relationship with Pinnacles National Park around 2011 when they hosted one of the first cultural burns or prescribed burns that had been held in the park for probably more than 300 years. In 2011, they burned a segment of McCabe Canyon, what we referred to as just the grass field, where there is almost, my best estimate is like 2 to 3 football fields of deer grass. It's an immense field, and it was a great success and a great start to the relationship for Amamutsen and the National Park Service. Some of the more recent work, though, that we've started to do, this was last year during a field school that was hosted in part with University of Oregon and Amundsen Land Trust, Amundsen Tribal Band, and then my tribe. When we had a couple days in Pinnacles, we had a week in Pinnacles actually of work, which we had to get up at 6 a.m. to go to work, so we could get off at 2 p.m. so we wouldn't die in the middle of the day. When we all came together for that week to do archaeology in the park, we kind of basically had a breakdown of what I've all told you here tonight. This history, reconciling with it, trying to figure out, a lot of this archaeological record has gone missing. We're basically looking for what's left. And there are things that are still found in the park, if you can believe it. Um, Several of the rangers and Timothy Babulus himself, they've reported finding things in the park, and to their credit, they will rebury them whenever they find things like mortar stones or anything else that is culturally sensitive. What we're trying to do, though, is we're trying to take a different method to the archaeology at the park. A lot of this stuff has been taken, it's gone, or it's just in someone's collection somewhere. And if they ever give it back to us, we'd be so generous, but let's not hold out too many hopes. So what can we do without the physical things? Um, when I was at University at Fresno State, one of the big conversations, the big up and coming technology that we all wanted to get into, but we didn't really have the funding for at our school was LiDAR and ground penetrating radar. So when we were at Pinnacles last year, I believe this was like mid-July, we were there. We were working on some of the areas. This is the amazing deer grass field that we all got to work on again. Some of the tribal stewards who we had out there, they actually had worked back there during 2011, and they're like, "Dang, it's been a while since I've been out here." You know, we got to work in those areas again, and um, we got to bring out ground penetrating radar for some of the areas, not in McCabe Canyon, but other parts of the park. This is not at Pinnacles. This is at another site. This is an undisclosed site. But this is just to give you guys an idea of how the process works for ground penetrating radar. Um, and the areas that we were able to scan in Pinnacles, we only had really 2 days to do the ground penetrating radar last year, 2 real full days of ground penetrating radar. This is one of the sites we were able to come up with in the park. And if you look, you can kind of see where the red line is. There's a little bit of a divot, there's a divot and a fill-in. And this sort of divot fill-in, we believe, because this is like, I want to say 8 meters below surface, or yeah, give or take. And it's a 3 meter diameter hole that has been filled in. To our best guess, we believe it's actually a house pit. Is a potential house pit that has been preserved in the park. Now, these are the things you can't take from the park. The actual dirt in the soil. I mean, you could theoretically if you brought out a dozer, but this is one. You know, we're trying to find more and more proof to show that we were here, that we existed, that where our village sites were, and all of the actual foundations of our like the willow bark and all these things have rotted away over so many centuries. But things like this, the house pits, they still exist in some means and matters. I provided an example here on the right of a Yokit's house pit, generally of the same diameter, 3 meters. As some of you may know, a lot of our houses were made of willow bark, no, willow frames and tule bundles for the actual like walls of the house. And so what we're thinking is there may potentially be more house pits, more if we can prove that there are more of these in the park and show evidence of that, then we may be able to locate an actual village site. We may not know the actual name of what this site is, but we'll know that there were people living at this specific spot. And just to give an example, if anyone's doubting, I don't think you guys are, but this is what it kind of looks like when there's invalid evidence. This is due in part to cell phone interference, but you can kind of see there's a straight line across. There's just uneven soil levels. Compare that to that. Pretty big difference in my opinion. So this is one of the other things we did during the internship last year. We got to put some regalia on display to try and show people. This is obviously a recreation of our regalia, but what we wore traditionally speaking. And what we're looking towards now is working with National Park Service to um, create a policy in regards to the collection of artifacts, if there are any to be found. Two, to resurvey the archaeological district that is at Pinnacles National Park, the Chalone Creek Archaeological District. We're trying to work with UC Berkeley and the National Park Service to create a program and means of surveying these places, but then also going further than just resurveying places. We want to see, how do all these sites that we're looking at connect up to each other? Is there a wider range that we should be looking at? And so this is one of the photos we had of some of us tribal members and then some of the students from UC Berkeley who came out to do a site walk. And hopefully, depending on how the programming goes, we're hoping to do some more work at Pinnacles this year, maybe 2, 3 days of ground penetrating radar at Pinnacles National Park to establish more of those house pits. Because those, in my opinion, are the big ticket item. It's one thing to have a mortar in your hand, that's one thing, and that, is deserving of all the love and respect that it deserves. But finding a house pit, that's something that the cultural resource manager of the park said, he's like, we've never found anything like this. We've never had ground penetrating radar come out in this area where we thought, the initial survey said that there was nothing here, that it was clear to be bulldozed. And well, the top layer of the site we surveyed had been bulldozed, but the bottom layers, those were well preserved still, and those are where we can still find things. So ekwe etuntene. I usually say ituntene, which means it's finished, but for us in our archaeology, it's not finished. We still got a long way to go, and we've got a long way to connect all the dots for just Pinnacles region alone. This isn't even including the Clear Creek management area, where there is also a whole lot of stuff that has been documented. People like Brecht Parkman and I believe Gary Brashini and people like that, but it's trying to introduce that tribal perspective and plan out and see how did all these regions interconnect and showing that we were here, that we do have history, and that even if it isn't physically still there, it was there at one point. So thank you all. I'm open for any questions if you all have any.
About the chat has questions.
Oh, okay. Yes, Pat.
Do you know how many archaeological sites have been officially reported inside the park?
Inside the park, we're talking depending on the
He's already asking questions, but yeah.
Oh, hi Dylan. Sorry, with my friend. In terms of depending on the records you go within the boundaries of the park itself alone, we're looking at upwards of like 100 different sites, like of the park alone. And those are just within the official boundaries of Pinnacles, Pinnacles National Park.
Right.
Depending on the records that you look at, if you have access to the Northwest Information Center, there are a lot of these sites which, in my opinion, and from what I've read and seen, being granted access to them, a lot of these sites, they were recorded in 1970s, 1980s, and they had a very much so CRM approach to them, where it was just contract survey, get the job done, record the site to the best of their abilities, but like not trying to connect it to the wider cultural landscape or potential village areas.
Right.
So in the park itself, though, most of the sites tend to be seasonal, like especially in the Rocky Crag areas of the High Peaks area, like around the High Peaks. But on the eastern side, there is a lot more potential habitation areas.
That also San Benito County, the eastern side.
Yeah, the eastern side of San Benito County, and then the western side of the park gets cut off by Monterey, like in the last quarter mile.
One of the I believe he's on Zoom today. He contacted me. Paul Hampson did work out there with Gary Brashini, and he was asking about your presentation. I found out that I messed up the link.
Oh no.
So I did go back and fix it with Mike's help, but because I'm not that technical. But yeah, he mentioned to me that he had done work out there with Gary Brashini, probably back in the 80s or something.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's trying or anything.
Oh, Gabe. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you. Thank you, Dylan. My friends. Oh, yep.
Were there teams at the Shalom were camping seasonally, as well as seasonally on the Stans River? Or is that pretty much wiped out by flooding and?
The archaeological record for the Salinas River, yeah, a lot of those, a lot of the lower levels of where habitation sites would have been about 200, 150 years ago. Yeah, a lot of those are wiped out. Any of those sites that would have been on the Salinas River, they are most likely near the confluence of the Salinas and the Oro Seco, which tended to flood massively. But in some of the expedition records from the Spaniards, they did say, I believe there was at least one report that said the area near the mouth of the Chalone Creek, Metz area. It's not really a town, it's just like it's a designated unincorporated area. It's on where the mouth of Chalone Creek is on the western side of Pinnacles, not completely out of the park, but still part of the Pinnacles range. They did say that there was most likely like a seasonal camp out there, and that had just been either abandoned or the people who were living there had left to go hunting or something. But the Spaniards who crossed into that area during their expedition did say that, there was evidence of people being there at least.
And so that the tribe was moving around seasonally following food sources, or is there any other reason, were they mining something out there?
Specifically for Pinnacles, it isn't really the best place for mining things. Any of the like, there may have been some chert exchange. We've never really found obsidian in Pinnacles National Park for any of the arrowheads. But rhyolite though, rhyolite, basalt, jasper, chert, we found plenty of projectile points that are made of those materials. A lot of the more mining may have taken place out towards San Benito mountain range, where there are deposits of steatite. There's a major deposit of steatite out in San Benito mountain area, as well as cinnabar, which we used for traditionally as pigmentation for painting, the body, tattooing. Might make you go insane if you get a tattoo made out of cinnabar, but it was a means to do it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. That's why Idri was out where that was.
Yeah.
So the radar thing, I've never heard of that before.
Ground penetrating radar.
And how big, you showed the picture, that was actually from Pinnacles and Field, but the picture you showed with the evidence.
So the actual radar waves,
Yeah.
yes, that record, that scan was done at Pinnacles itself, undisclosed location, of course. That was conducted at Pinnacles at just a generally flat area, which didn't have too much vegetation, though. One of the issues with ground penetrating radar is if you're on bare soil, you're good. You can scan through the bottom layers of the soil pretty well, up to a couple meters. But once you start running into grassy fields, heavy rooted areas, places that haven't been culturally burned, basically, you start running into issues. And even places that have been burned, where the brush has been reduced, it creates unideal conditions, kind of puts the radio waves off more or less for scanning.
And I didn't realize
The first time ground penetrating radar was used for archaeological purposes was up at Mission Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
They were trying to test it. Rob was doing some work up there and they wanted to test it out. And they tested it up at the mission there at the Santa Cruz Church.
Mhm.
There's some very funny stories about what their intent was. It was the group of Livermore, up at the Livermore, that's where we developed. Yes, that's where they developed the ground penetrating light. And the scientist who was doing it was very excited about it. It was her big breakthrough. She wanted it because she wanted to develop it so they could find the first temple in Jerusalem, because she had read that if you could find it, that was the task, and then the world would come to an end.
I don't think I'd want to find the temple.
Need that story right now. We just figure out what time we're.
So good off of that. I'm so good off of that.
That's where they first used it with archaeology, but we dropped there.
We have a semi-related question for that, I think, from Debbie. What are your feelings on the ongoing preservation of the California missions? Should they preserve? Should they be allowed to stay to decay? Tough question, one I wrestled with myself. So, yeah, this is a very difficult question, but I'll try to be as nuanced as I can about it. The missions, and this is me as a person who, I've had to grapple with this a lot as a indigenous person who was raised a Catholic and who is still somewhat kind of syncretic. You know, my grandmother and my great grandmother, diehard Catholics, but also diehard Native believers. Um, when it comes to the preservation of the California missions, I believe there's a way to do it and there's a way to not do it. And sadly, um, a lot of the missions which are overseen by the diocese, you know, for example, my mission, my tribe's mission, Mission Soledad, is overseen by the Diocese of Monterey. There is an unsaid policy um, when it comes to the history of the native people at these missions. And oftentimes we're having to argue with people who are representing the missions in terms of like, hey, you know, where are all the people who were here? You know, the actual remains of these people. You know, what are you guys doing to tell the history of the indentured servitude, the sexual abuse, you know, the horrific acts which happened, the rebellions which occurred, and the fact that, you know, we were forced into serfdom. That was the whole point of the mission system, was for the total cultural, religious transformation of California Indian peoples into gente de razón, the people of reason, because they saw us as uncivilized savages or almost children-like, as uh, Father Serra would describe us as. You know, they don't, the missions which are overseen by the diocese, they don't really talk about that history, sadly. They refuse to acknowledge it, and they usually will make it very difficult for us Native people to represent ourselves and to really have a say on any land which is owned and operated by the Catholic Church. The only two really good examples of preserving the history of the missions, which I see is like really the better way to go, would be that of the missions which are overseen by the California state parks, such as Mission Santa Cruz, half of Mission San Juan Bautista, Mission La Parisima, because the state is more obligated to have a secular and unbiased view to history and the true realities of the native people at the missions. Irregardless, I do believe the missions should be preserved, but in terms of who should be operating them, that's a whole other discussion. And you know, part of that wider discussion really is for a lot of us Native people, for my tribe, for us Solidarianos, Soledad people, we more or less kind of got cheated out of owning and operating the missions after the collapse. Um, as it's understood, a lot of our people from Mission Soledad refused to go back to Soledad, even after they offered to give us the land as a pueblo, because we were under the belief that we'd be forced back into servitude if we went back. And this was right after the mission system had collapsed. Our last padre had died. You know, the Mexican government was offering the land back to us, and they were telling all the natives, like, go back to your missions and you can turn your missions into pueblos. It's like there's nothing left for us there at the time. You know, the whole place was already looted. So, yeah, missions should be preserved, but they should be operated a bit differently. That's the long and short of it.
What do you do? Have you guys, your group thought at all of, bringing in like the Institute for Canine Forensics to look for the cemeteries at the mission Soledad?
I think we would be a good. There's a question that's actually semi-related to this, so we get two for one. I'm pretty sure my tribe would be very interested in doing that, but again, it runs into the whole situation of would dioceses allow it? They've allowed other universities to conduct archaeological survey. Oh, I think we're getting kicked out. To conduct archaeological surveys like CSU Monterey, but that was under completely different circumstances. you know. When it comes to a tribe who wants to do a survey and they're not just looking for artifacts, they're actually looking for things that the diocese wants to keep under wraps, then yeah, we're probably gonna run into a you know, death roll there for the project if we wanted to do it.
Probably worth a try. They think that there's, I mean, every mission has cemetery, so
Mhm.
it's probably, you know, still there somewhere, right?
Oh no, I mean, I won't get too into it, but yeah, it's definitely there. And I am also like a big advocate for canine forensics in the sense that like I believe it gives an extra layer of certainty for when there is human remains involved. I've run into some people who are very skeptical of canine forensics, and I'm like, there's a reason why they have three of them when they're doing the surveys.
Or
Yeah, they are. They're very professional, and they have good standards for their work.
and they're very effective, in their results also.
Yeah, and I love border collies. How many people passed the mission? That's a great question because we technically don't actually know. Um, Not in the sense that like a lot of the missions did have actual death rolls that were preserved. Mission Soledad is one of two missions, I believe, which did not have their death rolls preserved. They're thought to have been probably destroyed during one of the floods that occurred at the mission. As I always say, the Padres were really smart because they built Mission Soledad. They built it right on what was probably like maybe like a major seasonal settlement, but it was right on the confluence of the Arroyo Secto and the Salinas River, and it was like basically destined to continuously flood
Yeah.
there. You know, they were real smart for that one.
Yeah, well, I think they smartened down and moved it up on the top of the hill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they would have built it on the actual city of Soledad, it would have changed things a little
That's the
bit.
same thing happened in Mississippi Santa Clara, I think they flooded out 3 times.
There's a reason, you know, there's a reason why us native people moved around a lot. You never know what's going to change in the environment.
They needed close for water, but not.
Not that close. Yeah.
It's a seasonal thing, right?
Um, for Lynn on Zoom, I don't think it's in print anymore, but if you ever have the chance, I think they still have a couple of copies at Mission Soledad. If you are interested on any further history of Soledad, I have my copy right here. It's called It Happened in Soledad, and It Happened in Soledad Part 2, Reconstructing Soledad Mission. It goes over a lot of the early archaeology done by was Paul Farnsworth, I believe. A lot of that early archaeology and reconstruction they did, and the whole process of building back the parts of the mission that are actually still in operation today, that are basically built on the corpse of the old mission. And it gives a lot of good historical context for not just the areas as Chelones lived in, but also our basically neighbor slash cousin tribe, the Esselen Nahan or the Eastern Esselen peoples, which I am part Esselen. I shout out to that part of my lineage.
Great. Anybody else have any questions?
I just had one.
Yep.
One more. The house pits, was that a pit was dug as the kind of the floor of the house? Is that how that works?
Yes. So, when it comes to a house pit, you would basically dig an initial, in this example, it was a 3 meter diameter, 8 to 10 feet, give or take. You create an initial pit where the surrounding frame that would basically be made out of willow branches, you would fasten that around the diameter and tie it off to basically eventually create the frame of your tule hut. And so it also added an additional layer of insulation. Some of these huts were built with smoke holes. It wasn't super common depending on the material. Fires usually went outside, but sometimes they were built inside the huts as well. Yep, yep,
And then they do on top of the world.
yep, yep. Totally on the willow frame. Other materials were used at other times as well. Yep.
I've never excavated a home pit, but I have heard other archaeology describe the way to reset of the pits.
Mhm.
You know, the living space, I mean, like you said, it's so important to define those type of features because it's really people or living.
Yeah, and it's one of the trying not to get choked up here. It's one of the few physical living connections that we as native people, or at least for my tribe strictly in this case, it's one of the few living connections that we can have to our ancestors due to the fact that so much has been wiped away, so much has been lost, moved to other places, or just erased completely. The fact that we could find something like that, I wish my great grandmother was still around so that I could tell her. I would like go on for hours probably telling her, I'm like, Grandma, guess what we found? And she'd probably just listen to me all happy and just sweet eyed because that's how my grandma BB was. And she'd be like, "Oh, I'm so proud of you, Cammy." You know, it's very rewarding feeling that we did find this, that we were able to do this work. And I really do owe it to our partners, the University of Oregon and the Amundsen Tribal Band and Land Trust. They really did make it possible. And the National Park Service, of course, for even, if they really wanted to, they could tell us, well, you're not a federally recognized tribe. We don't need to, accommodate you. But they haven't done that. They've always been very much so courteous with us ever since our relationship started in 2013. Yeah. Okay, one last one. One last one. You're doing botanical surveys near the mission too? No, sadly not. Oh yeah. Yeah, well, thank you guys.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Next month, we have, and I can't remember the exact date, if anybody has their cell phone handy, it's the first Thursday of June. I think it's the 5th, but I'm not positive. Anyways, we have, Dr. Ruben Mendoza, who's, retired from CSU MB, who will be speaking for us in June. The fourth, on Thursday, June 4th, same time, same channel. And then we will not be meeting in July and August. We have our summer hiatus. And we will resume in September. I don't think I have a speaker yet for September, so I better get working on it. But thank you so much, Cameron, for coming.
Yes.
And he brought some books. And,
Yeah. I have my example of the house bin here that I used to reference.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
You better look at it.